Hello guys and happy new year's to everyone out there who's watching this video. So I made some progress in the holidays, in the Christmas holidays, where I finalized, maybe not really finalized, but the first working version, let's say, of the combat system of Masamune. And I uploaded, I think, 1 or 2 videos where I was just showcasing something, but without some explanation and talking. And in this video, I'm going to talk about a few things. And also, if you are interested, you can give me feedback if maybe I did something too complicated or maybe things could be done easier. I'm pretty sure that things could be done easier, but I am quite happy with what I have so far. And I implemented a couple of features, so buffs, debuffs, and effects and so on in the combat that I wanted to support, and they are currently working. And yeah, before we go into the details, let me give you a little bit of an introduction to the combat system and what is currently possible. So let's quickly start up the game. I made a test enemy in the village that you can fight when you interact with it. And oh wait, I need to resize that one. Yeah, that's a tiny little bug that I'm aware of with the background. So what we can do, oh wait, there's actually another bug. Let me restart once again. Then let's not resize. I know that I did something wrong with the resizing a couple of versions ago. Need to fix that so we don't resize, so that you see it properly. So in the end, what you can do in the combat is that you can attack, which is the sword icon. Then you can cast some magic, which got upgraded now. That's more like now some fire explosion effect or something, and you can use items in the combat. And the combat itself is round based, so it's one after the other, and every entity actually has an agility, and based on the agility, the unit or an entity is starting with its turn before all the other entities. So basically all entities get sorted by its agility, and the one with the highest one starts first. Then you can do some basic attack, which is a single target attack, where we have some target selection. Since it's single target, you can only select one target, and for example, let's attack the middle one. Then there is some damage pop-up, some shaking going on when you take damage, some effects as well. Then we can cast magic. There is different kinds of magic. For example, the firebolt, which has a multi-target selector, which allows you to select an arbitrary amount of enemies. So it could be one. So for example, this one here is now selected because it's highlighted in red. You can also deselect everything and go back, of course. And let's, for example, attack those two. So how it works currently, I'm not sure if I will keep it like that, is that you simply select all the different enemies, and when you select one more, which is already selected before, or when you have selected all enemies, then it starts casting with the multi-target selector. So in that case, I just want to attack those two. Does a little bit of damage as well to both of them at the same time. Then there is, of course, also some healing effects. So we can, for example, heal for, I think, 20 hit points. Yes, that's also working. There's also the mana and life progress bar at the bottom with the numbers that you can also see that as well. And finally, the fireball, which is an attack which attacks all enemies and explodes 2 times in a row. So 1, 2. So the 2 butterflies are now eliminated. And that one is now also dead. There was some rainbow color for the damage now, because there's also some critical strike available, both for the attack there is a critical strike, and also for your spells. They can also potentially do critical damage, which is called an arcane strike in this game, and that simply increases the damage. There's also, let me show it to you. So there's also some summary, what kind of experience you get, how many talents, which is the money in the game, and what kind of enemies you have defeated. So 2 butterflies and 1 larva. And then also the enemy on the main world disappears, and we can move forward. There are currently a couple of attributes in the game. There is strength, which increases the physical damage. So when you attack with your swords, in that case, it will increase the damage. Then agility, as mentioned, that one defines how fast you can attack in the combat. There's constitution, which is increasing your hit points in the combat. Then there is intelligence, which is increasing the damage of your spells. Then the normal attack for a physical attack. Then you have armor, which reduces physical damage. You have resistance, which reduces magical damage. Then you have physical evasion and magical evasion, which where you simply evade a physical attack or a magic attack. And critical and arcane strike. And as mentioned, critical strike is I think it's twice the damage of your normal physical attack, and arcane strike is, I think, 75% stronger than the normal magic attack. And yeah, so that's basically it. So it's working. I tested it a few times. There's also, I considered some special things. So for example, if you target an enemy and that enemy actually dies before you attack it, for example, with the fireball, you have 2 explosions, and if the enemy dies already from the first explosion, then that enemy is not targeted again. Then there is some logic in the background where it will search for the next possible target which would be available and simply attacks that one. So basically, when you attack something or cast something and the enemy disappears or whatever, then you simply target the next available enemy instead of just wasting your round where nothing happens. I think this is how it was done in very, very old Nintendo area RPGs, where your attack basically went into the void and did nothing if the enemy died before that. And yeah, what I implemented the last day or last 2 days, let me open up here the combat test screen for that, is that I introduced some buffs as well, so that you can also have some special effects which last for maybe several attacks, for several rounds, some passive abilities as well, that, for example, a regeneration when the turn starts, that an enemy maybe regenerates 1/3 of his maximum HP and things like that. So I was working on that, and let me show it to you now in this combat test screen, where it's basically what we saw before. It simulates the real game, but in a test environment where it's easier for me to try out stuff and play around with the combat system. And one of the things is, for example, that I wanted to implement was a nullification, so that you don't get any attack damage or magic damage. And we can try that out with let me check, button 1 and button 2, exactly. No, button 2 is already reflection. Let me check, the nullify magic damage is 4. So when I press 1, then all enemies now have a nullification effect. So when I attack them with my physical attack, they should not get any damage. So that is what we saw here. Ignore the special effects. So all the animations, those are just some placeholders that I put there. But as you have seen, so there was a special effect. This enemy did not take any damage at all. And this nullification, the way I added it for in the test environment, is that it nullifies 1 attack. So if I attack now this butterfly again, now it takes damage and dies. And the mushroom again, so that you can see it, that one still has the effect for now. It got now blocked, also a sound effect displayed, and nothing happens. Then the same I wanted to have for magic attacks. So that is now I press number 4. And now when I do some magic attacks, so for example, this firebolt, then that one also does not deal any damage. That's also blocked now in a special way. If we cast it again, then the mushroom should now take damage. Yes. So that was also working. Then I thought of some special effects, for example, where you want to return some damage, so reflect some damage. For that, let me quickly restart the combat so that we have all enemies available again. And I think it's button 2, for example, which is now adding this reflection buff to all the enemies. So when I attack now the butterfly, maybe it only reflects if they survive. Yeah, exactly. Okay, it is like that. So we have seen that now. So the mushroom survived, and when it survives, then it reflects the damage. I can actually do it both ways. So I can reflect before the damage of the player is applied, but I can also reflect after the player damage is applied. I tried out both, and for now I went with the later version. So I think it's better, or for me it felt better, that first you deal the damage to the target, and then if it survives, then it will reflect the damage back to you. I think that felt more natural to me. And yeah, the same thing is then, of course, possible with magic as well. So for that, I need to press which button? Nullify number 5. So I press now number 5. And now when we use the firebolt again, just on the butterfly, I hope he survives. Yeah, so that was the reflection effect. There's also currently just a placeholder, so it's this fire explosion effect. And I'm not sure, is it just for one turn again, I think, right? Yes, just for one turn, he's reflecting the magic damage. So things like that is possible as well. Of course, basic stat manipulation, like increasing the damage of your attack for a couple of rounds, or increasing your strength, intelligence, whatever, for a period of time. All of that is possible, of course. And finally, that one was a little bit of a tricky one, where I had to re-implement the entire system a little bit. I thought of something. So we have now this reflection that, for example, this butterfly here can reflect the damage back to the player. And I was thinking of what happens now if both entities actually have a reflection damage. You would basically get a simple endless loop. So the butterfly is reflecting to the player is reflecting back to the butterfly again reflects back to the player, so forth and forth on. So that one would be quite stupid. So I decided yesterday to implement it in a special way. And basically what I do, so that's number 6, where all gets the reflection magic buff, for example. So when I now use the fireball, you will notice something. So before it simply... did I not press the button? Wait. Number 6. Okay. I didn't press the correct button. Okay, so it might have been a little bit confusing to understand what is happening, but the way I implemented it now and the decision that I made is that when both entities actually have some sort of reflection where they deal damage back to another entity, then this happens only once per, let's call it an effect. An effect would be to deal damage. So basically when I cast a fireball on both entities, then the first entity, for example, the system detects it has a reflection buff. So it reflects the damage back to the player. And at that point, I stop let's say, the endless loop. So the player, of course, also has the reflection, but he was like the original source of the damage. So I thought it's a little bit stupid if he would now also reflect the damage back. That is how I had implemented it before. And basically the damage is then jumping in between those two entities for a couple of times until the buff disappears. And that felt to me a little bit stupid in a round-based system. And also I thought about old games like, I think it was it Final Fantasy VII or something, where you could cast, or was it Secret of Mana actually? So when you cast Wall on your character, which was reflecting any magic spell that was cast to you. And I think if you had the Wall spell or wall effect and the enemy had the wall effect, then the spell still got reflected back to you. So your wall then simply got not accounted for. And yeah, so I made a very similar decision with that. And that's it for the showcase, I would say. Again, I have all the features available that I had initially planned. Oh, wait, I have one feature that I did not show to you. There was one final one, also a special one. I think that's automatically available. Let's see, which was a transformation. So that one I thought for boss fights. So for example, if a boss has multiple phases and maybe he transforms from one sprite to another sprite with different spells and so on. And there also you somehow need to prevent that the combat ends. So if the boss is the single enemy and you kill his first phase, then the combat should not end because actually he should transform into the next phase, and only when all phases are done, the combat should end. And I think I added that to the mushroom. Let me quickly check. So when we kill it, it should transform into the player entity for now. That was also just some testing with this transformation effect. Yeah, exactly. So we saw that now. So the mushroom slowly faded out and this new entity faded in, which is now the player, and which now basically the transformation, which is also a normal enemy. So you can select it, attack it, and so on and so forth. And the combat will still continue. And what is happening with this transformation is basically when an enemy dies, so when it would die, it adds a certain effect that I will explain then in the second part of the video. And actually before then the combat victory defeat condition is checked, the entity will get transformed, and then the combat continues until you kill now the second form, the second stage here. And yeah, that was everything that I wanted to have. And so far it's working out quite well. So I'm quite happy with it. And now a little bit about how I implemented that. So there are a couple of things that I want to talk about. So let me share that with you. So first of all, the combat system in general, where I implemented one like that in the Quilly Crawler game, I think 1 or 2 years ago, which was quite a struggle. And also adding new things in the end was then not so easy because it was really, I would say, a little bit of a messy functionality that I implemented there. It worked, of course, but it was not the best implementation, I would say. So this time I had, of course, a little bit of experience and learned from the mistakes that I did in the past. So the first thing that I changed was the combat system itself. And how is that working? So I thought of when you think about the combat system or this turn-based system, there's always a couple of things that are actually happening for each turn. So we could summarize it. For example, a turn is, I would say, a turn starts. That could be, for example, before or at the beginning of a turn, for example, some regeneration effects or whatever, or a pop-up that the next turn in the combat is starting, whatever. All entities in the combat have no decision made at that point, so they don't know what they will do in this turn. And the next thing that needs to happen now would be that the player needs to select what kind of action he wants to perform in the combat. So that would be then, for example, player choose, let's call it action because that is how I called it. So the next thing would be in every turn, a turn starts, then the player chooses an action. When the player has chosen an action, then enemy AI chooses action. So then whatever we use there, all the different enemies need to decide what they are going to do in this turn. Then, when we have done all that, then we need to sort, in our case, the entities for upcoming round by agility. And then we actually need to perform each action. And finally, we need to end the turn or whatever we want to call that. And basically, so you can, it's always the same. So no matter in which turn we are of the combat, it's always a couple of things that are happening afterwards. And the way I implemented that in Quilly Crawler, I think, was that I just had one system in our entity component system. And there are a lot of different if checks. So are we currently in that stage or are we in that stage, and then do this and that. And the logic is a little bit different then for depending on what kind of branch I am. In addition, there would also be something in global so that we need a check victory defeat. So if all players are dead, you lost the battle. If all enemies are defeated, you won the battle. And this thing somehow needs to happen all the time. And not all the time, but at least during the perform action, for example. After each action, you always would need to check periodically if the victory or defeat condition are met, and then simply abort the combat and stop it. And yeah, so I thought about that, and what I found then quite interesting is that actually what I need is somehow, like we have it in GDX AI with the how's it called, with the state machine, where you have different states, and you can also have a global state which runs before the real state, let's say, of the state machine. If you've watched my tutorial, then, or maybe you are already familiar with GDX AI, then you know what the state machine there is. And basically, I did now the same in the combat system, and that worked out quite well. So instead, let me zoom in a little bit, instead of having a very long class with a lot of different if checks and so on, my combat system now just has the different combat states. So idle would be at the beginning, so when the player needs to decide what kind of actions he wants to do. So that was all the part where we have chosen what kind of magic we want to use, if we want to use an item, if we want to attack, and the target selection. That is all happening in the idle state. Then when the player has chosen his actions, we are going to prepare the round, which is basically sorting the entities by their agility and executing some actions or buffs, which should happen when a round begins. Then we have a state for performing the different actions. So one by one, every entity executes its action that it has chosen. And there's also then a victory state and a defeat state where nothing is happening. So in the victory state, you have this combat summary with the experience that you have gained, and you can go back to the game. And in the defeat state, you have a pop-up that you can retry the combat and start again, or you simply give up. And you have then obviously not defeated the enemy. And in addition, so to this current state, which is just one of the states that we have above, I also have a global state. And the system then itself, so the combat system, is then rather simple. So it simply reacts to certain events that I'm firing in the game. So for example, when a combat start event is happening, then we change the state to the combat state idle, and the global state is then this combat state check victory defeat stuff. And what is happening in change state? So change state basically is like very similar to the state machine. It gets the state from the initial states that I have here, and then it switches out the states from the current state. If there is is there any active, it will call the exit method, and from the new state, it will call the on enter method. So if I need some cleanup code at the end of a state or some initial code at the beginning of a state, then I can use the on enter and on exit method of a combat state. And other than that, during an update, we just have the update call to the global state first. So that's in our case to check if victory or defeat is met. And other than that, it's just an update of the current state, which is currently active. So update method is, or the system itself, the combat system and the component system is then very, very, very simple. It simply reacts to the events like combat start, next turn, player action is, for example, when all the players have chosen their actions, then we go to prepare round. The prepare round state, I think, is then firing the begin event, which then changes the state to the perform action. And this check victory and defeat global state, that one is firing at some point player defeat or player victory event. And then we also simply update the state machine. So the combat system, to summarize it, is basically just a state machine with a global state and a current state. And that one made it then a lot easier to implement the basic concept or the basic turn. So with this, what I've described before, so turn start, player choose action, enemy choose action, and so on. That was then rather straightforward to implement because I have dedicated states here. And let's take a simple one, the prepare round, for example, which are usually very short classes as well with their own code. So for example, here in the prepare round state, I just have on enter. If it is the first round, then it performs some passive action. Like for example, this transform effect of the mushroom is actually a passive action, which adds this transform buff to the entity so that it has it from the beginning of the combat. And yeah, this would be an example for this passive action execution here. Then here is currently still a to-do. So there I need to add then the enemy AI, which is currently missing, where they are choosing then what kind of action they want to perform. Currently, it's always just an attack single action that they are performing, and it's always just on the first player entity that is available. So that's a to-do for me in the future to update. Then the sorting is happening. So as mentioned, the sorting is then happened by the total agility, which can also be, so you have the agility of the character, then the character has equipment, maybe some buffs which are increasing or decreasing its agility. So that's why the sorting needs to happen every turn, because the agility is not a constant at the beginning of the fight. It can also change throughout the fight. So there's the sorting then happening. And at the end of the sorting, it fires then this combat turn begin event, which then brings us to the perform action state. And yeah, that would be, in my opinion, one better solution than what I did in the past, is to use here a state machine for the different combat states. So that made it very convenient and easy to understand what is happening at what stage at the combat, because it's really then some very small classes, usually because it's not very complicated what is happening at one specific step in the combat. And yeah, there I simply have those different states available. Also the global state, which is checking for victory and defeat stuff. I can check that one, or show that one to you here as well. So basically this global state, as we have seen before, always gets executed before the real state. So the update is happening before, and it simply checks if all players are dead, then player defeat is happening. If all enemies are dead, then player victory is happening. So what if both? So if all would die, the players and the enemies, then actually the player would lose. So one player needs to be alive. That is the way how I implemented it here. And I think that's, to me, that's more natural how it should behave. And you see as well a very small state class, just 40 lines of code in that case here. And that's it. So that's the state machine for the combat system. And that was one improvement, I would say, that I did over the past implementation in the Quilly Crawler combat system, for example. Then we come to this little block here. So I have 4 classes currently that I needed for the combat. And why did I need that? So to explain it a little bit, as mentioned before, every entity can perform an action during combat. An action would be to attack with your physical attack, to cast a spell, like for example the fireball, or to use an item, like for example a mana potion. All of that, whatever you can do in combat, that is a so-called action. And that, so somehow we need to add to an entity what kind of actions it can perform. And in an entity component system, to me, that was quite obvious. So we need a component, which I called combat component. And the combat component has a list of actions available. With that, we already know what kind of things an entity can do during combat. We can then, with the AI, for example, pick a random action, or depending on the situation, it picks a certain action and then executes it. So that would be one piece of the puzzle, let's say. But then we also need to somehow define what kind of actions does an entity actually have? And since it's part of a component, it's somehow a little bit weird. So we have normally you have some, or at least that's how I work, you have a character or object configuration of your game object, and that has nothing to do with an entity component system or anything. So we need like an abstraction level above that. So instead of having a component and a list of actions, an action also has some logic, what it's really doing, a target type, and so on. So since I have all my configuration currently in the tiled object editor, let me quickly go to the combat test and let me open up here the combat objects. So these are the test objects in the combat test screen. And one of the things that you can configure in tiled is a combat action. So for example, the player in the test has the attack single action. He has a firebolt, he has a fireball, and he can use items, but he cannot cast, for example, heal. He has no Inferno Scroll, he has no item mana restoration, and no transformation. On the other hand, when we go to the mushroom, for example, that one just has attack single and a transformation ability. And this one here, so this simple, let's call it an enumeration because it's actually an enumeration. So this enumeration here is then what I call a so-called action type. So this is like the configuration part of an entity that I can define what kind of actions it can perform. So for example, in the combat screen, what we have seen before, let me remove, for example, the fireball here and save it. So if we go back now to our combat screen test, now, when we go to the spell book, we don't have a fireball anymore. We have the firebolt, the other spell, and healing, but we don't have a fireball. Actually, you might ask, why do we have healing? Because it's not selected in here. This is also what I wanted to test in the screen, is that the player actually has an item, this one here, and the item actually has the heal ability. So that's why the player also gets it during combat. That is why you see here the heal ability. But the important part in the end is that we have here some, just a simple enumeration of all the different actions which are available in the game. And this configuration part, I called it action type. And with an action type, you can then actually create an action itself. And the action is then the real class instance, which is performing the different actions. To show you that in the code, I showed that in the previous video, so I will not show that again. I have a Gradle task, which is generating some stuff out of the tiled maps of the tile project file. And what that task is now also creating, it's creating this action type. So you see that here, this is an auto-generated class by Gradle blah, blah, blah task. And there you see all the different action types, which I did not show that. We actually define in tiled. So in here, I just add a new value like, I don't know, ice or frost circle or whatever spells I want to have. I just add here a new enumeration. Then I start the Gradle task. So this generates tiled stuff that I have shown before. And when I run that, then it creates this class here. So it creates then all the names equal to what we see here in tiled. And in addition, they also have a factory method, which is then creating the real action instance. So this is all those things are automatically created. I don't need to do anything in this class. The important part is when I add a new action type in tiled, it gets added here, and it then also automatically registers, let's say, a factory method, which is creating an instance of an action. And here, let me quickly show you just a firebolt action, for example, that you see something. So an action, what is it? It is linked to an action type. Then it is linked to a target type. So is it a single target, multi-target, all target? And does it have any mana cost? So it will reduce then this mana cost when an entity is performing its action. Also, it's checking. So if you don't have enough mana, then you cannot perform this action during combat as well. And then an action has several methods. So it has this can perform check, which is checking if it has enough mana. It has a combat start method, which is called, when the combat starts, so just once at the beginning of the combat. It has an on start, on finish method, and then update method. And the update method returns true when the action is done, so when everything was performed, and false otherwise if it needs to continue. In case of the firebolt action, it's quite easy, so it just deals some magic damage. So the source of the action deals 8 damage divided by the amount of targets to all the targets which were selected. It creates a special effect, this fire 1, over 1 second. It scales this effect by 2. It also plays the sound effect explosion 1, and it adds a delay of 1 second until the next action is performed. So this is how that is working. So to summarize it once more, because that is I would say the core principle of the combat system, we have an action type, which is the configuration of an entity, and then we have an action which contains the logic, what needs to be performed. And then, as mentioned, I also wanted to have some special effects like a nullification or damage reflection and things like that. And there I was thinking, how could I implement that? Because that one, at least for me, is not so trivial. And the approach that I have chosen there now is a very similar one to what you have in Magic the Gathering, in the card game, if you have that, for example. And basically what I have is effect. So that's the bottom class here. An effect is then something, a final thing that is happening in the combat, which is then really performing a specific thing. Like, for example, it creates the special effect graphic, it plays the sound file, it deals damage, it heals an entity, things like that. So when we see here this deal magic damage, what that is basically doing, it creates or it adds 3 or 4 different effects to a so-called effect stack. So one effect would be, as mentioned, the special effect, this fire 1. Another effect would be to play the explosion sound. And another effect would be to deal damage to the different targets. So in total, that would be 3 effects. And I have then an effect stack basically in the combat. And what is happening now here? So when we deal magic damage, in a very simple scenario, if there are no buffs or any special passive abilities or something on an entity, we have then, as I just mentioned, we have a special effect, we have a sound, and we have the damage that is dealt. So this would be, those 3 effects are getting added to the stack, and then they are executed one by one from top to bottom. But of course you can, or at least in my combat system, you can react to certain things. And when we go into the deal magic damage method, let me go inside here. There's the important part. So at the beginning, there's just some calculation if we have critical strike, including the resistance, calculating the real damage. And then there is the important part. So here below you see this effect stack that I was talking about, where we add the sound effect, the special effect, and the damage effect. And before that is happening, there could also be some buffs on the target and also on the source. So for example, on the source, pre-magic damage, we could have some effect which is increasing our magic damage or whatever, increases our intelligence or whatever. So basically it influences the damage. So that's why the damage here can get updated. Then the target itself, which gets attacked, can have some magic damage taken buff. So where it can, before it takes the damage, so pre-magic damage taken, it can again do certain things. and in theory add certain things on the effect stack, like for example, a nullification effect. Then we have the real stuff that's happening, and then some post effects that could happen. So for example, post magic damage, I don't know, the player gets healed for a certain amount of hit points when he dealt some damage, and also post magic damage taken for the target itself. Here it's for the target and here it's for the source. So post magic damage done or dealt and post magic damage taken. And with that, so with this effect stack, I can now have a very flexible system, I would say, where we can, if we play that through in our mind. So let's say we deal magic damage like this to a single target, but this target is now reacting in the pre-magic damage taken. It has a pre-magic damage taken buff, and it basically nullifies the damage. So the damage gets reduced to 0. And we also want to play here some special effect and sound effect. So inside here, it would add the, let's say, nullify sound and nullify SFX. And since they are happening before that, on the effect stack, they are up here. If they would get added afterwards, so where is it? This post here, post magic damage taken or post magic damage, then all the things are added below the real effect of the player. And with that kind of setup, I can now very flexible choose what should happen before something and what should happen after a certain event. So that applies currently to physical attacks, to magic damage, to heal effects, and things like that. And yeah, in the end, during an action, so when an action gets performed, we just add certain effects to this effect stack. As you see it here, so this stack then adds up. And then at the end, so when the action and all the buffs and so on got executed, then I have a final stack with all the effects that need to be performed. And then it's very simple. The stack then just goes through one by one and does whatever the certain effect is then doing in the end. So effect is always just the final thing that is then really happening. I hope that makes sense. That made sense. Of course, you can always check out the code on GitHub as well. I will add the description or the link in the video description below. And with that, let me quickly think. I think that's everything that I wanted to share. So that is currently the combat system of Masamune. It was the effect stack part. So the effect that the effect stack actually got added at the end. Before I just started with that setup here. So combat system, action type and action. That was not so difficult to implement, I would say. The special things like choosing a different target and stuff like that. That one was a little bit more tricky, but also not super complicated. So that went quite well. But when I went to the effects or to the buffs, so for example, damage reflection, and if both entities have a damage reflection, that one was then a little bit tricky. But with this effect and effect stack setup, it is now also, in my opinion, a rather clean solution, which allows for a lot of flexibility. Of course, there are also special things that you need to consider. So what I have, an effect is always linked to a source and to a target. And why is that? So imagine we have we made a physical attack, for example. So we deal damage to enemy 1. That would be one effect on the stack. Let's ignore the special effects and the audio files. And at the top, we have maybe one more damage to enemy 1. For whatever reason, let's say that's 2 times on the stack. But now, after this effect gets executed, let's say that the first enemy is now dead. So there, I think it's a special case. I'm not sure that adds maybe, just to give you an example, that would add a dead effect to the stack. After this one, so of course we can always add any effect in between, but also everything else below, which is related to enemy 1, like, I don't know, enemy 1 plays roar sound, and I don't know, enemy 1 transform is a bad example, plays special effect with fire, something like that. So basically, when this effect gets executed and this enemy 1 dies, so it gets removed from the combat, then of course all effects which are linked to enemy 1 also need to be removed. And that's why every effect has always a source and a target link. And basically what I do, so if an enemy or if an entity dies, in that case enemy 1, I go through the stack and check for all that. Let's remove that one. And check for all the effects which have either a source or a target with enemy 1. And then I remove them. And in my opinion, that makes sense because imagine, again, we deal damage to enemy 1 and that one added some post effect, like it would, I don't know, deal damage back to us where it plays a sound effect and a special effect. And of course, if it dies, all of that is not happening anymore. So of course, the things that it would execute should get removed. And also in our case, if we would deal damage to it, that also does not make sense anymore because it's already dead. So of course, we would remove that one here as well. So that's how this effect stack is also working. So it also has a little bit of logic in it, but not a huge amount. And yeah, so I personally will go through it once more. So of course, refactoring is always necessary. That was just some quicker dirty. It's not that dirty, but a quick implementation draft of the combat system that is currently working. But still, there's always some methods and some code pieces that can be written a little bit better. And that is what I will do most likely the next couple of days. But with that's it. Quite a long video. If you are still there, thanks again for watching. Hope that was some interesting insights to how I approached the combat system in Masamune and how it worked. Again, if you have some feedback or maybe a nice article where someone describes how he implemented that, a working solution, would be great because I did not find anything. I couldn't find anything in the internet. There were always just some very, very simple examples which did not really help me with the requirements that I had. So the reflection nullification buffs and that you can react before and after an event and so on. All of that I wanted to have. I could not really find there a fitting article which described something there. So all of that is just coming from my own mind. But yeah, again, if you have something there, then please let me know and share it. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Have a nice rest of the day and week. Bye bye.